Hi, and welcome back to LEAP review for biology. So just to recap our previous lessons, we're in Unit 3, which is our evolution unit. And this is going to be our last lesson for Unit 3. But let's just recap real quick what all we learned in Unit 3. So we learned about bacteria and viruses. And we learned how that when they make you sick, they can upset the homeostasis in our body. And so we learned about the different body systems and how those body systems work together to maintain a steady internal environment. And when bacteria and viruses and other pathogens come along, that upsets our homeostasis, and our body has to work to get back in balance. We learned a lot about bacteria, and we learned that bacteria can sometimes become resistant to the antibiotics, and we learned about how that occurs and how some variations of bacteria are stronger than others, and those tend to survive when are more likely to survive when antibiotics are introduced. And do remember that antibiotics only work for bacteria infections. They don't work for viruses. And then after that, we talked about natural selection. And so natural selection is Darwin's mechanism that he proposed for how evolution has occurred. And so evolution is change in life forms over time. And so by way of natural selection is how Darwin explained that evolution did occur. And so natural selection is closely related to a very common phenomenon that we've all heard of. Probably it's the survival of the fittest. And so natural selection says that those organisms that are better suited for their environments are more likely to survive and reproduce. And when they reproduce, they pass on their genes. And so over time, those traits that those genes are coding for become more predominant in a population. So we looked at the grasshoppers, and we saw how the green grasshoppers had better camouflage, so they didn't get eaten. The yellow grasshoppers kind of stood out. They did get eaten, so more green grasshoppers survived and reproduced and passed on the genes for the green color. And so over time, the population of grasshoppers changed. Okay, so now our final lesson, we're going to look at, we know how different life forms have changed through natural selection. And we saw how that could work in bacteria with the different varieties of bacteria and some being stronger than others. But now we're going to look at some evidence that scientists have found that supports the theory of evolution. So we're going to look at fossils, embryology, comparative anatomy, and DNA. Okay, so the fossil record can, scientists can determine how old a fossil is based on the layer of rock it is found in. So when scientists are digging down deep into layers of rock and they find a fossil, they can get a general idea of how old that fossil is according to how deep down in the rock layer it is found. So you can see that the layers that are up here on the top are younger. They only are as old as 60 million years ago. So this fossil right here, they would date it about 60 million years old. But then these fossils way down here deeper are much older. And so when they dug these fossils up, they would date them to be about probably 550, 600 million years old. Okay, so that's how they determine how old a fossil is. They also have other methods called, one of those is radiometric dating. You may have heard of that. It's where they use carbon and different other elements like uranium, and their radioactive isotopes to determine the age, the more exact age of the rocks. That's radiometric dating, and you get a more exact age. But with this relative dating, we can get a general idea. If it's up closer, if it's not as deep, it's not going to be as old. The deeper down it is in the rock layer, the older the fossil is. Okay, so the whale is a great example of how the fossil record has shown evolution to occur. And so we're going to focus on the whale, but there's other animals that have evolved over time, like horses, for example, and the fossil record shows that too. You can look it up. There's lots, if you're interested, there's lots of different examples, but we're going to focus on the whale. And what we're going to be talking about are transitional fossils. And basically, a transitional fossil is one of a life form that has traits similar to both its ancestral group, which is its older group, and its more recent descendant group. So if you'll look over here, this shows you the evolution of whales. And you can see that this is the modern day whale right here. The oldest one is the humpback, and it has been around for the last 34 million years. Okay. And then before the humpback was the Basilosaurus. And so they found fossils of this Basilosaurus, and they've been able to date those fossils around 34 to 40 million years ago. And then going on up, all the way up, you'll see that they found these fossils and they know relatively how old they were. And so how they know that they're related to the whale is because all of these fossils that are in between here have some characteristics of the modern day whale. And the modern day whale has some characteristics of these older fossils. Okay, so like starting with the oldest one, the Pakicetus. Let me go to the next slide. So the Pakicetus, go to this one. The Pakicetus was found in a place called Whale Valley near Pakistan. And they found this fossil, and it was interesting because it was definitely the fossil of a land animal. It had the bone structure of an animal that walked on the land. However, they found this fossil in Whale Valley. And the reason why they call it Whale Valley is because it's a desert now, but they have found all these fossils of aquatic animals and shells of aquatic animals. So they know at one time Whale Valley was a big body of water, and it had lots of life forms living in that body of water. And that's where they found this fossil of Pakicetus. So they know that the Pakicetus either lived in the water or near the water, most likely near the water. And the reason why they think this Pakicetus is related to the modern day whale is because of the ear structure. So a whale has a very distinctive ear bone structure. And the reason why it's distinctive is because whales can hear underwater. But whales are not like fish. Whales are mammals. Whales give birth to live babies, just like horses and cows and people and all other mammals. And so for them to be able to hear under the water, they have to have an ear structure that is quite different and quite distinct from other mammals. And so this Pakicetus, looking like a land-dwelling mammal as far as its bone structure when they found it, had the ear structure of a whale. Okay, and then they also found this fossil in this whale valley that used to be full of water. Okay, and then they found other fossils that were not as old. So let me go back to this slide. So they found fossils of the Ambulocetus, which was 49 to 48 million years ago. And you can see the difference between the Pakicetus and the Ambulocetus is you've got shorter rear legs and a longer tail. And the Ambulocetus had slightly webbed toes, and it also had that ear structure like the whale. Okay, so you can see how it had some features like the Pakicetus. It still had 4 limbs, but it was beginning to look more like this guy, the Rhodocetus. And the Rhodocetus did live in the water more than it lived on land. And you can see that it had little tiny limbs that were not able to support it on land. It couldn't walk around much on land with these little tiny limbs, whereas this Ambulocetus probably could still come out of the water and walk around. This guy probably did not. And he had a long tail, so he could swim pretty good. He had webbed feet. And again, he had that whale bone ear. And then even younger or more recent than the Rhodocetus is the Dorudon. And you can see in the Dorudon, those hind limbs are gone. They just, and the front limbs have developed into flippers. And so this guy looks much more whale-like than this guy, but the features are similar in other ways, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then around 40 to around 34 to 40 million years ago, the fossil of the Basilosaurus was found, which is the most recent ancestor to our modern day humpback whale. Okay, and you can see that those hind limbs completely went away just after this one. Okay, so if you'll look at the bone structure of these hind limbs, so here's your Pakicetus, and obviously the Pakicetus could walk on land. And then you got your Ambulocetus, which probably still could walk on land, but the toe structure was different, and they started to have these webbed toes. And keep in mind that both of these have that ear bone like the whale. And then when you go to the Dorudon, you see that that hind limb is almost completely diminished. It's still there a little bit, but what's even more interesting is here is our modern day whale. And modern day whales still have these little tiny bones back here. It's called a vestigial structure because it has no purpose. But when scientists look at it up close, it is definitely similar in structure to a pelvis bone and a leg. And it even has like a joint structure right there. And so although it has absolutely no function in the modern day whale, it is still there. So it's kind of like our appendix, that we still have it, but it no longer serves a function. We don't need it anymore, but at one time we in our ancestry, we did need it, probably because our diet was so different and it was part of our digestion. But that structure indicates that at some point back in time, the ancestor of the whale had hind limbs. Okay. And another example of transitional fossils is in the nostrils. So the Pachycetus, remember again, it had the ear bone structure like the modern day whale, but the nostrils were on the front of the skull, like a land mammal would have, like a wolf or a coyote or something like that. Okay, and then this fossil, the I don't even know how to say it, Aetocetus, that is 25 million years old. It is related to, it's one of the whale transitional fossils. You can see that the nostrils are on the middle of the skull. So they're not down here on the end like the Pachycetus. They've kind of transitioned to this middle part of the skull. And then your modern day whale, the nostrils are way back here on the back of the skull, which of course we know is their blowhole. And so this is a good example of transitional fossils showing how change over time occurred or evolution occurred in the whales. Okay, so that's what we can learn from the fossil record that helps us to see how animals have evolved over time. And this is just one example. Like I said, there are other examples that you can look up. If you just want to Google transitional fossils, you can find more examples. Okay, another piece of evidence that scientists say strengthens the theory of evolution is the study of embryos. That's called embryology. And an embryo is an unborn or unhatched offspring in the process of development. So embryo is still inside the mama or inside the egg, depending on the type of embryo it is. And evolution scientists believe that similarities in embryological development of different species indicate common ancestry. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples of that with some images. So if you'll look at these 6 images, these are all embryos at a very early stage of development. They're still either inside the mama or inside the egg, depending on what animal they are. But they are 6 different animals. And there is one of them represents a human. So take a look at that and see if you can guess which one is the human. Okay, so it's impossible. I'll just tell you. They look so much alike. And notice how all of them have a tail. Okay. And all of them have these little things right here. And those are called gill slits. So in some of these animals, these will develop into gills, and others will develop lungs. And so you'll see in just a minute, they all have an eye spot and an ear spot. So they're basically so similar that you cannot tell which one is which. Okay. Now, here they are a little bit further along in development. So now can you tell which one is the human? You might be starting to get a little bit of a clue. You can obviously tell that A and B are not going to develop into a human. You can see that the gill slits have developed into gills right here. And these are I can't remember what they're called, but eventually they fall off, and this animal has lungs eventually. And then you can see how the tail is going away in these last four. It's getting shorter, maybe not going away, but getting shorter. And the gill slits are still there. Okay. So it's a little bit harder to tell with C, D, E, and F, which is which. Ah, here we are, close to the end of the embryonic development. These are what they look like when they're born. And so, of course, you can tell that the last one was the human. So let's see them side by side from the beginning of development till this point. So you can see that A was the fish, and B was the salamander, C was the tortoise, D was the chicken, E was the rabbit, and F was the human. And so based on the similarities in embryological development of lots of different organisms, scientists believe that that indicates common ancestry, which means that they all came from a common ancestor. Okay, and then comparative anatomy is also some of the evidence that is used to support the theory of evolution. So homologous structures are body parts that appear in different animals, and they are very similar in structure and location, but they don't necessarily share the same purpose. But they do suggest common evolutionary ancestry. So if you look at, these are the forelimbs, the front limbs of 5 different animals, with one of those being humans. So I guess I should say mammals. But if you look, the bones in these forelimbs are color coded, so you can see how the structure of the forelimb is so very similar, and how the bones are in the relatively the same location in all these different animals. So in the human forearm, you've got your upper arm bone, which is the humerus, and then your lower arm bones are your radius and ulna, and then your wrist bones, the orange ones here, are your carpals. Your metacarpals are in your hands, and then your phalanges are your fingers. Okay, and if you look at each one of these animals, they have all those same bones. So here you've got the cat that has a humerus, a radius and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. The horse also, even though the radius and ulna are fused together in the horse, it's still, you can tell that it's still 2 separate bone structures here because of the way this top part comes off. And there are still the carpals, the metacarpals are all fused into one, and the phalanges are all fused into the one. With the bat, this is a wing, so it's not like an arm or a forelimb of a cat or a horse. It's a wing, but when you look inside the wing, you see the humerus, the radius, ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. And with the dolphin, again, it's not like an arm or a forelimb. It is a flipper, but inside that flipper, there are bones, and the bone structure looks very much the same as all these other mammals, with a upper arm bone, the humerus, and then 2 bones beneath that, the radius and the ulna, and then the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. So obviously, a dolphin does not use these phalanges in the same way that a human would use their phalanges, but yet there they are, just in the same location and then the same general structure. So these, by comparing the anatomy of these different life forms, scientists believe that these similarities suggest common ancestry. And then the final, we don't need that. The final piece, oh wait, before we get into the DNA, let me show you this too. This is an example of vestigial structures. And though I mentioned that when we were talking about whale fossils and how modern day whales still have these pelvic and leg bones. They're real tiny, and they're considered vestigial because they no longer serve a purpose, but they're there. And so that indicates at some point in their history of development that whales probably had back limbs. Okay. And on humans, there's lots of different vestigial structures, things that we have that we don't need anymore, like our appendix, I said, but all these other things as well. And this, I love this one because on the underside of a snake, you'll see these little spurs, these little bone structures that stick out. And if you look inside the snake at the actual bones themselves, you'll see that they look very much like a pelvic bone and a leg bone. And so scientists believe that the ancestor of the snake had legs. So that's very interesting. Okay. Now let's look at the DNA. Okay, so scientists now, since DNA has been discovered and the genomes of so many different animals, including humans, have been mapped, scientists can make comparisons between the DNA of all kinds of different life forms. So what you're looking at here is the amino acid sequence for a protein called cytochrome C. So if you'll recall from our Unit 1 lessons, that proteins are made up of amino acids. So this is a protein that is found in lots of different animals, especially mammals, and some reptiles as well, cytochrome C. And cytochrome C, like all other proteins, is made up of amino acids. So each letter in this long sequence represents an amino acid. So scientists can look at the amino acid sequences and compare them. And based on the number of similarities between the amino acid sequences, they can predict how closely related two different life forms are. So here we've got the amino acid sequence for a human's cytochrome C protein and the amino acid sequence for a kangaroo cytochrome C protein. And if you'll look, everywhere I have highlighted, there is a difference. So the first 6 amino acids are the same in a human and a kangaroo. But then in the next 6, there are 2 differences. So in the human, IIM, KSQ, but in the kangaroo, it's IVQ, KAQ. So if we count the differences between the human and the kangaroo, we'll find that there are, let's see, there's 2 there, 1 here, that's 3. And then there's 2 here, 4, 5, and there's 2 here, 6, 7. And then there's 1 there and 1 there. So there's 9. There's 9 differences in the amino acid sequence between a human and a kangaroo for this particular protein, cytochrome C. Okay, so yeah, that's quite a bit of difference. It's not a whole lot, but there again, humans and kangaroos do have a lot of things in common as far as that they're mammals. But let's look at another set of amino acid sequences and make another comparison for cytochrome C. So in this comparison, we have the human again, the amino acid sequence for cytochrome C, and we have the rhesus monkey. And when you look at this is very interesting. So all this, the amino acid sequence is exactly the same all the way down to right here. And right here in the human, it's IIG. And remember, each letter stands for an amino acid. And in the rhesus monkey, it's ITG. So there is only one amino acid difference in the cytochrome C protein between humans and monkeys. And so this is just, again, this is just one protein out of thousands of proteins that are in humans and monkeys, but they have found other proteins that are very, very similar between humans and monkeys, and the DNA sequences itself is very similar. It's like over 90% similarity. And so based on that, evolutionary scientists believe that the human and the monkey have a more recent common ancestor than, say, the human and the kangaroo, or the human and the frog, or the human and the bird. Okay. All right. And then once they have looked at all this evidence and they have determined how different life forms are related as far as their common ancestry, scientists can make a cladogram that puts them in order based on how closely they are related to each other. So on this cladogram, all of the animals that are above this mark have vertebrae. That means they have a backbone. And so all of them, sharks, the ray fin fish, all the way up to crocodiles and birds. Okay. So they have a common ancestor in that they all have a backbone. Okay, they're not like a jellyfish or something that doesn't have a backbone. But then when you get past the sharks, there is something else that the sharks do not have, but all the rest of the animals above do have, and that is a bony skeleton. So sharks don't have a bony skeleton. They're more like fish. They do have that backbone, but they don't have, well, the ray fin fish do have the bony skeleton, but they're slightly different. And then when you move on up to the 4 limbs, that's when the fish and the sharks break off and are no longer as closely related to the ones above on the cladogram. And so everything above this line has 4 limbs. So amphibians, primates, rodents, crocodiles, and birds. So birds have 4 limbs because they have 2 wings. And so you see how a cladogram works. And you can tell that based on the way this branches off and then these 2 branch off like this, that primates and rodents are more closely related than primates and crocodiles, okay, or than primates and amphibians, because they're on this same line and that they have hair, okay. And then up here, you can see the crocodiles and the birds are more closely related to each other than they are to the amphibians, because they have eggs with shells, whereas the amphibians just lay their eggs without any kind of protective coating around them. Okay, so that's the evidence for evolution, and that is the end of Unit 3. Thank you for listening and paying attention, and I hope this helps you. See you next time for Unit 4.